2,300 years ago, the world changed forever under the marching boots of one man, Alexander the Great. But his empire wasn't just built on battlefields. It was woven together by rivers that carried life and roads that whispered secrets across continents. Picture this, a network of pathways so vast, they connected the glittering cities of Babylon to the rugged mountains of Afghanistan, turning scattered conquests into a single, pulsing heartbeat of civilization. These roads and rivers weren't just dirt and water, they were the veins of an empire, carrying soldiers, ideas, and treasures to every corner of Alexander's realm. And today, we're going to trace those ancient pathways to uncover how they shaped history itself. Think about the last time you followed a road to somewhere new, the thrill of the unknown, the promise of discovery. Now imagine that road stretching 3,000 miles, linking cultures that had never met, languages that had never mingled. That's the power Alexander wielded. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers didn't just quench thirst, they fueled entire economies, turning barren lands into bustling trade hubs. The Royal Highway wasn't just a path, it was an information superhighway of the ancient world, where news traveled faster than ever before. But here's the twist, these routes weren't just tools of control. They became the DNA of future empires, inspiring Rome, Persia, and beyond. So how did a young king, dead by 32, leave behind a system so enduring that its echoes still shape our world? That's the mystery we're unraveling. From the hidden engineering feats that tamed wild rivers to the strategic way stations that kept armies moving, we'll walk in the footsteps of history's greatest empire builder. You'll see how a single road could decide the fate of nations, and how a river's bend might spark a cultural revolution. This isn't just a story of conquest, it's a blueprint of how vision, when paired with the land itself, can bend time to its will. So ready your curiosity, we're about to journey through the arteries of an empire that refused to fade. Alexander understood something many conquerors miss. Land is only as powerful as the connections that bind it. When he crossed into Asia Minor in 334 BC, he didn't just see cities to sack or armies to crush. He saw rivers waiting to become supply lines, mountain passes that could be transformed into trade corridors, and dusty Persian roads ripe for reinvention. Take the Royal Road built by the Persians centuries earlier. Where others saw a relic, Alexander saw opportunity. He widened it, fortified its way stations, and turned it into the backbone of his empire, a 2,500-mile lifeline where messengers could race from Sardis to Susa in just 7 days. That's faster than some modern postal services, but rivers were his secret weapon. The Indus wasn't just a boundary, it became a liquid highway ferrying Macedonian soldiers deep into India. The Nile didn't merely water crops, its predictable floods timed military campaigns, ensuring troops moved when the land could feed them. And here's the genius, Alexander didn't just use these routes. He improved them. His engineers built pontoon bridges that could appear overnight, allowing armies to strike where least expected. They dug canals to reroute rebellious rivers, proving even geography bowed to his will. This wasn't just logistics, it was psychological warfare. When local rulers saw Persian roads repurposed with Greek mile markers, or watched Macedonian ships dominate their ancestral rivers, they understood this empire wasn't passing through. It was putting down roots. Every fortified river crossing whispered control. Every restocked way station screamed endurance. And perhaps most brilliantly, Alexander made these routes two-way streets. Yes, they carried his armies outward, but they also brought back silks from China, spices from India, and ideas from Babylon. weaving a cultural tapestry no battlefield could create. The true test came after his death. While other empires fractured, Alexander's network held firm for generations. Those roads and rivers became the threads that stitched together the Hellenistic world, proving his greatest victory wasn't at Gaugamela or Hydaspes, but in the dirt and water that outlived him. Because when you control the pathways, you don't just rule land, you shape history's flow. Long before Alexander's armies marched across Asia, the Persian Empire had already stitched together its vast territories with an engineering marvel, the Royal Highway. Stretching over 1,600 miles from Susa to Sardis, this wasn't just a dirt path, but a carefully maintained thoroughfare with way stations every 15 miles, where fresh horses and messengers stood ready. The Persians understood that speed meant control. Their famed royal couriers could cover the entire distance in just 9 days, relaying orders faster than any rebellion could spread. But Alexander saw something more. Where Persian kings used the road to enforce obedience, he envisioned a living network that pulsed with trade, ideas, and military flexibility. His first act, doubling the number of way stations and fortifying them as miniature garrisons. Suddenly, a messenger route became an empire's nervous system. Macedonian troops could now mobilize from Babylon to the Aegean in weeks, not months. Merchants found guarded rest stops where they could trade safely, their carts laden with Babylonian linen, Greek olive oil, and Indian spices, all traveling the same well-patrolled path. Take Sardis, the highway's western terminus. Under the Persians, it was a regional capital. Under Alexander, it became a cultural crossroads where Greek architects rebuilt its agora, while Lydian goldsmiths taught their techniques to Macedonian apprentices. Or consider Susa, where the road's eastern end met the royal treasury. Alexander didn't just loot its gold, he transformed it into a distribution hub, using the highway to funnel wealth back into infrastructure projects across his empire. The real genius lay in standardization. Alexander introduced uniform mile markers carved in both Greek and local languages, so a trader from Phrygia and a soldier from Thessaly could both gauge distances accurately. He ordered the road widened to accommodate marching phalanxes side by side with ox carts, ensuring military and commercial traffic never clashed. And perhaps most crucially, he connected the royal highway to new roads, like spokes on a wheel, linking it to the Indus Valley in the east and Egypt's Nile in the west. This wasn't just maintenance, it was metamorphosis. Where Persian arrows had once flown down the highway to quell revolts, now Greek theater troops traveled it to perform in newly built amphitheaters. The same ruts that once carried tribute to a distant king now bore textbooks from Aristotle's pupils to libraries in Afghanistan. Alexander didn't just walk the royal highway, he made it dance to a new rhythm, one that would keep beating for centuries after him. The Tigris and Euphrates weren't just ribbons of water cutting through the desert, they were Alexander's silent generals, shaping his battles before a single sword was drawn. Picture this, his army, 40,000 strong, camped on the banks of the Euphrates in 331 BC, staring down the Persian forces. But instead of charging headlong, Alexander did something unexpected. He used the river itself as a weapon. By controlling the crossings, he forced King Darius to abandon his fortified position and fight on open ground at Gaugamela. That single strategic move, dictated by the Euphrates' geography, changed the course of history. These rivers didn't just shape battles, they fed empires. The Tigris became a floating pantry, its currents carrying grain barges from Babylon to feed Macedonian troops stationed hundreds of miles away. Ancient records describe how Alexander's engineers built floating granaries rafts loaded with wheat and barley that could be towed upstream by teams of oxen along the banks. One account even mentions a mobile bridge of boats that doubled as a supply depot, allowing soldiers to cross while simultaneously restocking their provisions. But the real magic happened between campaigns. The Euphrates served as ancient Mesopotamia's interstate highway, connecting newly founded cities like Alexandria on the Tigris to older hubs like Babylon. Greek architects shipped marble columns downriver for temples, while Babylonian astronomers sent star charts upstream to Macedonian scholars. The rivers became mixing bowls of culture, a place where Egyptian irrigation techniques met Greek geometry to create some of the ancient world's most productive farmlands. Alexander's mastery of river warfare reached its peak during the siege of Tyre. When the island city seemed impregnable, he turned the sea into a river by building a causeway. But his engineers took it further. They constructed siege towers on boats, floating them along the artificial waterway to batter the walls. It was a stroke of genius that blended naval and land warfare, proving rivers weren't just obstacles but instruments of conquest. Yet perhaps the most lasting legacy was how these waterways outlived their conqueror. Long after Alexander's death, the Tigris and Euphrates remained the lifeblood of successor kingdoms. The Seleucids used them to transport silk from China to Antioch, while Parthian kings built floating palaces to entertain diplomats midstream. Even today, modern satellite images reveal how many of Iraq's major roads still trace the exact paths Alexander's surveyors mapped along these ancient rivers, a testament to how thoroughly water carved the blueprint of empire. Alexander's engineers didn't just build bridges, they bent geography to their will. Picture this: 30,000 soldiers stranded on the raging Indus River's bank, their conquest of India hanging in the balance. While other armies would wait months for calm waters, Alexander's team worked through the night, lashing together hundreds of boats into a floating bridge strong enough to support war elephants. Within days, the entire army crossed what locals believed was impassable, appearing on the opposite shore like ghosts materializing from the mist. This wasn't magic, it was military engineering at its most audacious. The secret lay in standardization. Macedonian engineers traveled with prefabricated parts, ropes of flax treated with pitch for waterproofing, iron pins that could lock wooden beams together in hours, and collapsible leather pontoons that inflated like ancient life rafts. When they reached the Oxus River in Central Asia, facing currents that could sweep away stone bridges, they improvised by stuffing tents with straw to create buoyant supports. Ancient historians describe how local tribes watched in disbelief as these floating roadways took shape, some wide enough for 8 men to march abreast while fully armored. But the Hindu Kush Mountains posed an even greater challenge. Here, engineers became mountain goats, carving switchback roads into sheer cliffs at altitudes where thin air made every swing of the hammer an ordeal. They discovered that mixing local volcanic ash with water created a primitive concrete that could bind stones without mortar, a technique the Romans would later perfect. The most treacherous pass, nicknamed Alexander's Ladder, still bears grooves cut for wagon wheels 2,300 years later. What made these projects extraordinary wasn't just their scale, but their speed. While Persian kings took years to build royal roads, Macedonian crews worked with military precision. Scouts ahead of the main army identified river crossings, surveyors marked optimal paths, and specialized teams followed with grading tools. By the time infantry arrived, what had been goat trails were already widening into proper roads. At the peak of their efficiency, records suggest they could construct 1 mile of fortified roadway per day, an unheard-of pace in antiquity. The real test came in maintaining supply lines across these engineering marvels. Way stations weren't just rest stops but sophisticated depots with rotating stockpiles. Some stored grain in elevated granaries to prevent rot, Others had underground cisterns fed by gravity from mountain springs, the most crucial innovation. The rolling warehouse, ox-drawn carts with interchangeable cargo beds that could transition from carrying wheat to weapons without unloading. This logistical ballet allowed Alexander's forces to campaign 1,200 miles from their nearest supply base, a feat no European army would replicate until Napoleon. Roman engineers later studied these techniques closely, adopting the Macedonian pivot bridge design for their own campaigns. The famous Trajan's bridge across the Danube used the same floating pontoon principles Alexander pioneered in India. Even medieval Silk Road caravans followed pathways first cleared by Macedonian surveyors through the Hindu Kush. Though the man himself died young, his engineers' blueprints became the foundation for 2 millennia of empire building, proof that sometimes the mightiest conquests are those carved not in flesh but in stone and water. Long before camel caravans carried Chinese silk to Rome, Alexander's roads hummed with an even more precious cargo, ideas. Those meticulously engineered pathways did more than move armies. They became the ancient world's first internet, transmitting philosophy, art, and innovation across continents. Take the humble pomegranate, native to Persia. It traveled west in Macedonian supply carts, becoming a staple of Greek diets within a generation. Or consider the astrolabe, perfected by Babylonian scholars but refined by Greek astronomers in Alexandria. All because Alexander's roads made such collaborations possible. The real surprise, how quickly these routes transformed from military supply lines to cultural capillaries. Within a decade of Alexander's death, archaeologists have found Indian spices in Athenian kitchens, Persian carpets in Macedonian tombs, and Babylonian medical texts translated into Greek. At Ai Khanum in modern Afghanistan, excavations revealed a theater built with Greek acoustics but adorned with Hindu sun motifs, a literal fusion of worlds. Even language transformed. Official edicts in Bactria were issued in both Greek and Aramaic, creating a bureaucratic pidgin that smoothed trade from the Mediterranean to the Indus. Some of history's most unexpected exchanges blossomed along these roads. Greek physicians studying in Babylon brought back knowledge of Indian herbal remedies, while Persian architects introduced wind cooling techniques to Macedonian builders. The most fascinating evidence comes from tax records, papyrus scraps detailing duties paid on everything from Gandharan Buddha statues bound for Ephesus to Thracian honey shipped eastward. These weren't just goods changing hands, they were entire worldviews colliding and merging. Alexander's greatest legacy might be what traveled without wheels or hooves. The philosophy of Diogenes reached Indian ascetics, inspiring early Jain practices. Zoroastrian fire rituals influenced Greek mystery cults. Even military tactics cross-pollinated. Indian war elephants soon appeared in Seleucid armies, while Macedonian phalanx tactics were adapted by Mauryan emperors. Every milepost along those roads marked not just distance, but the shrinking space between civilizations. What made this system revolutionary was its reciprocity. Unlike later Silk Road trade flowing largely east to west, Alexander's network thrived on two-way exchange. A single excavated shipwreck off the Red Sea contained Egyptian papyrus, Rhodian wine amphorae, and Indian teakwood, proof that commerce wasn't just about luxury imports but practical interdependence. The roads even carried intangible treasures. Babylonian mathematicians introduced place value arithmetic to Greek scholars, while Indian fables like the Panchatantra began their journey westward to eventually inspire Aesop's tales. The ultimate testament lies in what survived Alexander's empire by centuries. Hellenistic kingdoms continued expanding these routes, with the Greco-Bactrians pushing trade into China's Tarim Basin. By the time formal Silk Road diplomacy began in the 2nd century BC, The groundwork was already laid, not by merchants, but by Macedonian soldiers who first strung together the oasis cities of Central Asia. Those dusty boots marching east carried more than spears. They carried the seeds of globalization itself. Alexander's conquests didn't just roll forward on wheels and hooves, they floated. When his armies reached the mighty Indus River, they faced a challenge no land route could solve: how to project power across a watery labyrinth stretching hundreds of miles. The answer came in the form of a fleet unlike anything the ancient world had seen. Shipwrights from Phoenicia, Egypt, and Greece worked side by side, hammering together vessels that blended Mediterranean durability with local knowledge of monsoon winds and shifting currents. These weren't just transport boats, they were floating fortresses, some carrying siege towers that could be lowered onto riverbanks like drawbridges, turning any shoreline into an instant battleground. The real innovation lay in flexibility. While Persian fleets relied on massive war galleys, Alexander's engineers designed shallow draft ships that could navigate tributaries barely deeper than a man's waist. Some vessels had detachable hull sections, allowing crews to dismantle and portage them around impassable rapids. Ancient accounts describe how during the siege of Multan, soldiers used collapsible boats made of stretched ox hides lashed to wooden frames, a design borrowed from Central Asian nomads but scaled up to carry entire platoons. This adaptability turned every river into a potential highway, whether in the delta marshes of the Tigris or the rocky gorges of the Hydaspes. Naval supremacy wasn't just about movement, it was about psychology. When Alexander's fleet appeared unexpectedly on the Indus eastern branches, local rulers saw their natural moats transformed into invasion routes. One particularly audacious maneuver saw Macedonian ships dragged overland for 40 miles to bypass a fortified bend in the river, a feat that convinced several chiefs to surrender without battle. The message was clear: no terrain, water or land could stop this empire, but the fleet's greatest legacy might have been what it carried besides soldiers. Supply ships laden with grain from Babylon fed advancing troops, while others transported prefabricated parts for bridges and siege engines. Some vessels served as mobile workshops, with blacksmiths repairing armor mid-voyage. Most remarkably, historians believe Alexander used hospital ships, floating infirmaries where Greek doctors treated wounded soldiers during transit, an innovation centuries ahead of its time. The true test came at the Battle of Hydaspes against King Porus. While war elephants terrorized Macedonian infantry onshore, Alexander's fleet executed a daring nighttime crossing upstream, using inflated animal skins as silent floats to mask their movement. Once across, they rapidly assembled prefabricated rafts to create a secondary landing point, splitting Porus' forces. This wasn't just a battle tactic. It was a masterclass in three-dimensional warfare, combining land, water, and engineering into a single devastating strike. Long after Alexander's death, these naval strategies lived on. The Seleucid Empire maintained patrol fleets on the Euphrates using the same modular ship designs, while Ptolemaic Egypt adapted the Indus vessels for Nile trade. Even the very concept of a standing navy rather than ad hoc wartime fleets can trace its roots to Alexander's permanent river armadas. From the shipyards of Tyre to the docks of Patola, his engineers proved that empires aren't just built on solid ground, sometimes they float. Keeping 40,000 soldiers fed in the deserts of Gedrosia required more than brute force. It demanded a symphony of planning that would put modern supply chains to shame. Every Macedonian soldier marching east carried 30 days' worth of barley cakes, but the real magic happened behind the lines. Hidden along the royal road, archaeologists have uncovered vast grain silos carved into hillsides, their interiors lined with bitumen to keep vermin out. These weren't just storage pits, they were mathematically spaced to match an army's daily march. A marching column could arrive at sunset to find precisely enough wheat pre-ground and waiting, with local bakers paid to have fresh bread ready by dawn. The relay system for messengers was even more astonishing. Persian couriers had pioneered horseback postal routes, but Alexander's innovation was specialization. Lightweight Armenian ponies carried urgent military dispatches, their riders swapping mounts every 8 miles at way stations staffed with veterinarians. For heavier cargo like siege engine parts, Bactrian camels moved in endless caravans, their padded feet silent on desert tracks. Ancient records describe how a message could race from Babylon to the Himalayan foothills in 11 days, a speed unmatched until the Pony Express 2,000 years later. Ships formed the third arm of this logistical triad. While most armies starved when venturing beyond river valleys, Alexander's fleet of grain transports shadowed his land forces. The Nile's annual flood became a calendar event for quartermasters. They knew exactly when to dispatch barges laden with Egyptian wheat to resupply troops in Syria. During the Indus campaign, sailors used monsoons to their advantage, timing arrivals with wind patterns Indian mariners had charted for centuries. What truly set this system apart was its redundancy. When a sandstorm buried camel caravans near Persepolis, backup routes through the Zagros Mountains activated within days. If river levels dropped too low for supply ships, mobile grinding stations appeared along the banks, turning grain into portable flour. Even the humble donkey played a role. Thousands were bred to standard specifications across the empire, each capable of carrying identical loads to simplify calculations. The brilliance lay in localization. Instead of hauling everything from Macedonia, Alexander's quartermasters created regional hubs. Dates came from Babylon, salted fish from the Caspian, and cheese from Cappadocia, all purchased from local producers to stimulate economies while reducing transport weight. Clay tablets from Susa reveal meticulous records. Exactly how many jars of olive oil could be traded for 1 camel load of cedar resin, or how many Persian archers could be fed per mile of march distance. This wasn't just about feeding mouths, it was about controlling space. A well-supplied army could afford patience during sieges. A network of stocked depots meant no rebellion was ever truly remote. When a Thracian chieftain once boasted his mountain stronghold was untouchable, Macedonian engineers simply followed his own supply trails backward to starve him out. The message was clear. In Alexander's empire, distance itself had been conquered. Alexander's cities weren't just dots on a map, they were deliberate cultural explosions. Take Alexandria Eshet, the farthest, founded deep in Central Asia near modern Tajikistan. On the surface, it was a military outpost guarding the empire's northeastern edge. But look closer, its grid of streets followed precise Greek urban planning, while its market stalls overflowed with Sogdian spices and Bactrian silver. The city's walls blended Macedonian masonry with local sun-dried bricks, creating a hybrid architecture that whispered cooperation rather than conquest. Here, a Greek playwright might debut tragedies in the amphitheater one night, while Sogdian musicians performed epics about Silk Road caravans the next. These cities functioned like cultural petri dishes. At Ai Khanum in Afghanistan, archaeologists uncovered a gymnasium where Greek athletes trained alongside Indian yogis, their routines merging into new forms of physical discipline. The city's temples displayed an unprecedented mix: Greek columns crowned with Persian lion motifs, Hindu fertility symbols carved beside statues of Hermes. Even the coinage told a story: gold drachmas minted with Zeus's face on one side and the Hindu god Vishnu's chakra on the reverse. This wasn't haphazard blending, it was deliberate policy. Alexander offered tax breaks to mixed marriages, incentivizing Greeks to wed local nobles and create a new ruling class fluent in multiple traditions. The secret lay in urban placement. Every Alexandria sat at a strategic crossroads, river confluences, mountain passes, oasis junctions. Alexandria on the Oxus controlled the Amu Darya's ferry points, while Alexandria in Nicosia commanded the roads to India. Like neurons in a vast network, these cities pulsed with information. A Babylonian glassblower's technique could reach Egypt's workshops within months, while Greek medical texts translated in one Alexandria might surface in a healer's kit hundreds of miles away by harvest season. Architecture became diplomacy in stone. In Egypt's Alexandria, the Great Lighthouse used Phoenician engineering techniques, but was staffed by Egyptian priests who interpreted its flame as a symbol of Ra. The city's famous library didn't just collect Greek scrolls, it actively commissioned translations of Zoroastrian hymns and Vedic mathematics. Meanwhile, in Central Asia, bathhouses combined Greek hypocaust heating systems with Persian steam rooms, creating social spaces where elites negotiated over sweat and olive oil rather than swords. The true test came after Alexander's death. While his empire fractured, these cities thrived as independent hubs. Tax records from Alexandria in the Caucasus show Greek magistrates presiding over cases with Buddhist monks as advisors. Burial steles reveal families with Macedonian names worshipping local river gods. Most telling, the food. At a single dig in Jaxartes, archaeologists found remnants of Greek fish sauce alongside Sogdian apricots and Chinese tea leaves, proof that cultural fusion had reached the dinner table. These weren't just garrison towns, they were prototypes of globalization. When a Greek merchant in Bactria could buy insurance from a Phoenician banker to ship Indian pearls to Carthage via Macedonian roads, something revolutionary was unfolding. The cities became living organisms, constantly adapting. Their Greek-style agoras hosting Persian poetry slams, their theaters staging Babylonian eclipse predictions as dramatic performances. Even the gods intermingled. Zeus-Ammon syncretism in Egypt mirrored by Apollo-Mithra cults in Persia. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was urban decay. Centuries later, when the Kushan Empire rose, its rulers built new cities atop Alexander's foundations, inheriting that blueprint of multiculturalism. The very concept of a cosmopolitan metropolis where language, faith, and custom could coexist traces back to these experiments at civilization's crossroads. Alexander didn't just connect the world with roads, he planted gardens where its cultures could take root together. The thundering hooves of Alexander's cavalry didn't just echo across battlefields, they rewrote the rules of ancient warfare. But his secret weapon wasn't just the legendary Thessalian horses bred for speed, or even the armored companions who could turn the tide of battle. It was a revolutionary system that treated these animals as living, breathing infrastructure. Imagine a relay network stretching from the shores of the Aegean to the banks of the Indus, where fresh mounts waited at every way station like pit stops in an ancient Grand Prix. A messenger could swap horses 10 times in a single day's ride, covering distances that would have crippled lesser empires. Camels played an equally ingenious role. While Persian kings had used them as pack animals, Alexander's quartermasters transformed them into desert superhighways. Bactrian camels, those shaggy two-humped giants, could carry 600 pounds of supplies across waterless stretches where horses would perish. Their padded feet moved silently through sand, allowing entire supply caravans to slip past enemy lines unnoticed. Records from Babylon describe special camel units that transported disassembled siege engines, their loads carefully balanced to prevent shifting during desert crossings. The real brilliance lay in specialization. Light Arabian horses were reserved for scouts who needed blistering speed, while sturdy Nisaean breeds from Persia pulled supply wagons. Alexander's engineers even designed adjustable saddles that could be modified within minutes, adding extra padding for wounded soldiers or attaching cargo hooks for grain sacks. But the most startling innovation, water discipline. Cavalry units trained their mounts to drink on command during river crossings, preventing the chaos of thirsty animals bolting toward water mid-battle. Trade routes benefited just as dramatically. The same camels that carried arrows to the front lines returned laden with lapis lazuli from Afghanistan or cinnamon from Arabia. A single caravan could transport enough Indian pepper to fetch its weight in silver at Mediterranean markets. And here's the twist: Alexander didn't just use existing breeds. His cavalry masters selectively crossbred horses along the campaign trail, creating new strains adapted to specific terrains. The Hyrcanian horses developed near the Caspian had broader hooves for mountain trails, while Gedrosian camels bred in the deserts could smell water sources miles away. These animals became the empire's pulse. When Alexander founded cities in Central Asia, the first structures built were always stables and troughs. Tax records show Persian satraps paid tribute not just in gold but in prime breeding stock. 5,000 Sogdian mares were shipped to Macedonia as living currency. Even after battles, the careful tallying of captured horses took precedence over counting weapons or treasure. Because in an empire stitched together by roads and rivers, horses and camels were the needles that kept the fabric from unraveling. The legacy endured long after Alexander's death. The Silk Road's entire economy relied on the same Bactrian camels he had deployed as mobile supply depots. Roman generals would later study his cavalry tactics at Gaugamela, where horses had executed complex maneuvers like living chess pieces. And perhaps most remarkably, modern satellite imagery reveals many of Central Asia's caravan trails still follow the exact paths his scouts first mapped, a testament to how thoroughly hooves and feet shaped the arteries of empire. Alexander's empire didn't spread randomly across the map. It followed the invisible fingerprints of geography itself. Those sweeping conquests from Macedonia to India traced paths that rivers had carved over millennia and mountain passes had worn smooth through generations of nomadic feet. The Hindu Kush didn't just stand as a barrier. It presented a series of narrow gateways where a clever commander could funnel entire armies through valleys no wider than a city street. The Gedrosian Desert wasn't merely empty space, its deadly salt flats forced routes to cling to precise corridors where underground springs bubbled up between the dunes. Even the lush Indus Valley, with its maze of tributaries, channeled movement along predictable lines where fertile soil made supply lines sustainable. Ancient records reveal how Alexander's scouts became masters of terrain intelligence. Before each campaign, teams of advance riders, often local mercenaries familiar with the region, would fan out for hundreds of miles. They didn't just look for enemy troops, they studied the land itself. A scribe might note where certain grasses grew thickest, signaling reliable water tables beneath. Another would sketch cliff faces to identify the most stable routes for siege engines. The most valued scouts were hydrology experts, men who could taste river water and predict seasonal flow changes or detect mineral traces hinting at unmapped tributaries. This geographical savvy turned obstacles into opportunities. When faced with the seemingly impassable Sogdian rock fortress in modern Uzbekistan, Alexander's engineers noticed something the defenders had missed: a narrow goat trail winding up the cliffs where snowmelt kept the rocks damp and less prone to crumbling. Local shepherds, bribed with silver drachmas, guided elite climbers under cover of darkness. By dawn, Macedonian flags fluttered above what had been considered an unconquerable stronghold, proving that in Alexander's world, no terrain was truly impregnable, just poorly understood. Rivers presented their own calculus. The Oxus modern Amu Darya might seem like a natural highway, but its spring floods could sweep away bridges while summer lows left boats stranded. Alexander's solution, a network of fortified camps along both banks, positioned at intervals matching a day's march. When waters rose, troops could wait comfortably with stocked granaries. When levels dropped, engineers deployed prefabricated pontoon bridges stored precisely where currents were gentlest. This wasn't just crossing a river, it was domesticating it. The ultimate testament to this geographical mastery lies in the empire's endurance. Modern satellite analysis shows how many of Alexander's roads still trace the most efficient possible routes across Central Asia's brutal landscapes. 2,300 years later, highway engineers in Afghanistan and Pakistan often find their modern roads overlapping ancient Macedonian pathways, proof that when you truly understand the land, your empire's bones never fully crumble. The roads that once pulsed with Macedonian messengers and the rivers that carried Greek grain barges didn't vanish overnight. They faded, mile by crumbling mile, as Alexander's successors turned builders into warlords. In the chaotic decades after his death, the royal highways way stations became contested prizes rather than rest stops, their storerooms emptied to feed rival armies instead of merchants. Where fresh horses had once waited every 15 miles for imperial couriers, now bandits lurked in abandoned stables preying on travelers. The Euphrates, once patrolled by a unified fleet, became a watery battlefield as Seleucid and Ptolemaic ships clashed over control of its trade routes. This wasn't just decay, it was the unraveling of an empire's nervous system. The cracks appeared first in the details. Mile markers along the royal road, once meticulously maintained in both Greek and local scripts, were left to weather into illegibility. Bridges that had been rebuilt annually during Alexander's campaigns collapsed under neglect, forcing caravans into costly detours. A tax receipt from Babylon reveals the domino effect. When a key canal silted up, the price of Armenian timber delivered to Egypt tripled within 2 years. Without central oversight, regional satraps prioritized their own pockets over infrastructure. One governor near the Hindu Kush famously diverted river water to his private estates, starving downstream farms until entire communities abandoned the land. Military logistics suffered most dramatically. Where Alexander's armies could cross continents in weeks, his successors found themselves bogged down by deteriorating roads. During the wars of the Diadochi, Antigonus I lost an entire siege train when a neglected mountain pass gave way beneath his siege engines, a disaster that would have been unthinkable when Macedonian engineers regularly reinforced such routes. River fleets fared no better. The Indus patrol boats, once the terror of rebel tribes, rotted at their moorings as crews deserted to become mercenaries. By 300 BC, historians note that messages between Alexandria and Bactria took 3 months instead of 3 weeks, leaving generals to fight wars with intelligence as stale as last year's bread. Yet the true tragedy lay in the cultural severing. The vibrant exchange of ideas that had flowed along these routes slowed to a trickle. A library order slip from Ai Khanum, dated just 40 years after Alexander's death, lists requested Greek texts that never arrived, the roads too dangerous for scholarly cargo. Zoroastrian fire temples along the Tigris, once staffed by priests trained in both Persian and Greek traditions, reverted to isolationist practices. Even the empire's famed multilingualism eroded. Tax collectors in Cappadocia began issuing documents solely in Aramaic, unable to find scribes who still understood Macedonian Greek. Some regions fought back against the decay. The Seleucids maintained sections of the royal highway as late as 250 BC, their engineers inventing a primitive asphalt to resurface crumbling stretches. In Egypt, Ptolemaic rulers kept the Nile's irrigation channels functioning through strict corvée labor, a system so effective that Roman governors later adopted it wholesale. But these were isolated efforts. By the time Rome rose to dominance, much of Alexander's network existed only in fragments. A well-preserved bridge here, a silted-up canal there, like scattered bones hinting at a giant skeleton. The roads and rivers had always been more than stone and water. They were the physical manifestation of Alexander's vision, the threads stitching together a world-spanning tapestry. As those threads frayed, the tapestry became a patchwork of squabbling kingdoms, each clutching their piece of the unraveling cloth. What began as the greatest infrastructure network the ancient world had ever seen ended as a cautionary tale. Even the mightiest empires are only as strong as the pathways that bind them. Beneath the shifting sands of Central Asia, archaeologists have uncovered silent witnesses to Alexander's engineering genius, stones still bearing the chisel marks of Macedonian masons. At a dig site near the ancient city of Ai Khanoum in Afghanistan, teams found perfectly spaced foundation stones running arrow straight for miles, matching descriptions of Alexander's military highways. These weren't mere dirt paths but layered constructions, gravel beds for drainage, crushed limestone surfaces to prevent mud, and even curbstones to mark the edges. The most startling detail, grooves worn into the stone by countless wagon wheels, all spaced the same distance apart, proof of standardized axles enforced empire-wide. Recent satellite imaging has revealed even grander scale. Infrared photography shows ghostly traces of roads radiating from the Oxus River like spokes on a wheel, confirming ancient accounts of Alexander's engineers rerouting entire trade networks. Near the Indus, archaeologists unearthed a bridge support system using interlocking iron clamps, a technique previously thought invented by the Romans centuries later. But the real treasure lies in the small finds. A clay tablet from a way station near Babylon records the exact rations issued to couriers: barley for their horses, salted fish for the men, and even honey for treating saddle sores. This level of bureaucratic precision was unheard of before Alexander's reign. Some discoveries rewrite history altogether. In 2018, a team in Turkmenistan uncovered a sealed storage chamber beneath what was once a Macedonian garrison. Inside lay intact prefabricated bridge parts, pre-drilled beams, and coiled ropes treated with bitumen for waterproofing. These weren't emergency supplies, but strategic stockpiles placed at regular intervals along the Royal Road, allowing engineers to span any river within hours. Even more remarkably, pollen analysis on the ropes revealed fibers from 3 different regions, proving Alexander's workshops sourced materials empire-wide to avoid supply chain bottlenecks. Perhaps the most poignant finds are the personal ones. At a ruined way station in the Zagros Mountains, archaeologists found a child's leather sandal beside a Greek-style cooking pot, evidence of families living along these routes. Nearby, a scrap of papyrus bears a soldier's letter home, complaining about repairing road sections in the rain. These fragments humanize the infrastructure, reminding us that empires aren't built by maps alone, but by countless ordinary hands. Cutting-edge science now reveals how sophisticated these roads truly were. Geochemical analysis of soil samples along the Jadroja route shows layers of crushed seashells mixed with clay, an ancient form of concrete that prevented erosion in flash floods. LiDAR scans in Pakistan have mapped subtle embankments designed to funnel monsoon waters away from roadbeds, while drone surveys in Iran exposed hidden culverts that kept mountain passes dry. Even the spacing of way stations followed mathematical precision, always within a day's march of each other, but positioned near natural springs or defensible high ground. The ultimate testament lies in what these roads carried beyond soldiers. At a dig near ancient Bactra, archaeologists found hordes of coins minted from Spanish silver and Afghan lapis lazuli in the same chest, threaded on the same rotting cord. A single cobblestone from the Tigris River road bears scrape marks from Egyptian granite blocks being dragged to build Seleucid palaces. These silent stones tell a louder truth. Alexander's roads didn't just move armies, they fused continents. The Romans may have built roads that lasted millennia, but they stood on the shoulders of Macedonian engineers. Alexander's highways were the prototypes, rough drafts perfected by Rome's legions. Take durability. While Roman roads famously used layered stone, Alexander's engineers pioneered the underlying concept of roadbed stabilization. Excavations along the Royal Road show crushed limestone layers topped with compacted gravel, a technique the Romans later enhanced by adding volcanic cement. But here's what often gets overlooked: Alexander's roads were designed for speed, not eternity. His surfaces were slightly convex to shed monsoon rains quickly, allowing armies to march minutes after storms. Roman engineers would adopt this curvature but prioritize permanence over pace, sacrificing some mobility for roads that could endure centuries. Design philosophies diverged in telling ways. The royal highways way stations were spaced precisely 15 miles apart, the maximum distance a messenger horse could sprint before needing replacement. Roman post houses, by contrast, were placed every 8 miles for their heavier ox-drawn carts. Both systems standardized widths, but with different purposes. Macedonian roads accommodated phalanxes marching 8 abreast, while Rome's allowed 2 legionary columns to pass comfortably. Yet the most striking similarity lies beneath the surface. LiDAR scans reveal both empires used identical surveying tools, the groma for straight lines and chorobates for leveling, proving Roman engineers inherited more than just ideas from their Macedonian predecessors. The true legacy emerges in how each empire used its network. Alexander's roads pulsed with cultural exchange, Greek theater troops traveling alongside spice caravans, Babylonian astronomers sharing roads with Indian philosophers. Rome's highways, while equally vast, primarily moved soldiers and taxes. That difference reflects their builders' visions. Alexander sought connection, Rome demanded control. Even their bridges tell this story. Macedonian pontoon bridges were temporary marvels, collapsible for rapid troop movements. Roman stone bridges, like the monumental Pons Fabricius, were statements of eternal dominance. Yet Rome's greatest debt lies in logistics. Alexander's rolling warehouses, those ox-drawn carts with interchangeable cargo beds, became the blueprint for Roman supply trains. His system of depots with rotating grain stocks inspired Rome's Annona Militaris, and when Trajan built his famous Danube Bridge, its floating pontoons copied designs Alexander's engineers had used on the Indus 3 centuries earlier. The irony: Rome's roads outlasted Alexander's not because they were better engineered, but because his successors lacked the will to maintain them. Those crumbling Macedonian highways still whisper a lesson. Infrastructure isn't about stone and mortar, it's about the vision to keep it alive. To Alexander's soldiers, the Ganges wasn't just another river. It was the boundary between the known world and the realm of gods. Local priests spoke of its waters washing away lifetimes of sin, its currents carrying the prayers of millions. When the Macedonian army reached its banks in 326 BC, they didn't just see a military obstacle, they faced a spiritual crossroads. Hindu holy men warned that crossing without purification rituals would invite catastrophe, and for once, even Alexander hesitated. His engineers could bridge any river, but how does an empire conquer reverence? The Nile presented a different kind of sacred challenge. Egyptian priests had long taught that the river's annual floods were the tears of the goddess Isis. Alexander didn't dismiss these beliefs, he embraced them. After being crowned pharaoh at Memphis, he personally led offerings to Hapi, the river deity, presenting golden statues at flood season. This wasn't mere political theater. By honoring the Nile's divine nature, he secured something more valuable than territory: the loyalty of priests who controlled granaries feeding half his empire. A single papyrus from this era shows Greek soldiers participating in the festival of the inundation, their helmets piled beside offering tables as they waded into sacred waters alongside Egyptian farmers. Omens flowed through these rivers like currents. At the Tigris, Babylonian astrologers read the swirls and eddies as divine messages, convincing Alexander to delay a crossing until the waters spoke favorably. On the Indus, his men watched in awe as schools of fish leaped onto the banks ahead of their advance, interpreted as Poseidon's blessing for the campaign ahead. Even setbacks took on mystical meaning. When flash floods wiped out a supply caravan in Gedrosia, local guides insisted the river demanded tribute. Alexander complied, ordering golden cups and weapons tossed into the raging waters, a sacrifice that coincided with the floods miraculously receding the next dawn. This spiritual pragmatism extended to founding cities. Alexandria on the Indus wasn't placed randomly. Its position aligned with a Hindu belief about sacred river confluences. Temples to Greek river gods stood beside shrines for local water deities, creating hybrid worship spaces. A recently unearthed altar near the Oxus River shows carvings of Zeus Ammon alongside Central Asian water spirits, their iconographies deliberately blended. Alexander understood that controlling rivers meant honoring their divine residents as much as their practical uses. The ultimate test came at the Bees River Mutiny. When his exhausted troops refused to march further into India, it wasn't just the distance that terrified them, it was crossing what Hindu scouts called the river at world's end. The Macedonians, already spooked by monsoons unlike anything in their homeland, saw the Bees as a cosmic boundary. Alexander's failed attempt to compel them revealed a hard truth: even the greatest conqueror couldn't command faith. In the end, he turned back not because his army was weak, but because their shared belief in the river's power proved stronger than any order. These sacred waters left an indelible mark on Hellenistic culture. Long after Alexander's death, Seleucid kings continued sacrificing to the Tigris as their ancestors had to the Spercheios in Greece. Ptolemaic coins showed the Nile's personified god embracing Greek cornucopias. And in a twist the conqueror might have appreciated, Indian texts from the Mauryan Empire began describing the Ganges as flowing westward, not just through land, but into the collective imagination of civilizations it connected. The true measure of Alexander's genius wasn't forcing rivers to obey him, but learning to speak their divine language. The same dirt that once muffled the march of Macedonian phalanxes now vibrates beneath 18-wheelers on the modern Kabul-Peshawar highway. Alexander's engineers would recognize every switchback. This asphalt ribbon follows the exact path they carved through the Hindu Kush 2 millennia ago. Today's satellite images reveal something astonishing. Over 70% of Central Asia's major trucking routes overlap with ancient Macedonian supply lines. Those aren't coincidences, they're testaments to how perfectly Alexander's surveyors read the land. The bends in the road that avoid avalanche zones, the bridges placed where river currents run slackest, these choices still dictate movement across continents. Rivers tell an even more dramatic story. The barges floating down the Euphrates today carry Iraqi dates and Syrian cotton just as they did in Alexander's time, only now they share the water with oil tankers bound for Turkey. Modern hydrologists have discovered that the busiest ports on the Indus, Karachi, Hyderabad, Sukkot, all sit precisely where Macedonian engineers established their original docks. The reason: Alexander's teams identified the rare points where river depth, current speed, and access to overland routes created perfect trade nexuses. Centuries of silt and politics may have reshaped the landscape, but the water's logic remains unchanged. Global shipping lanes still dance to Alexander's tune. The Suez Canal, that crucial shortcut between Europe and Asia, follows a route first surveyed by Macedonian scouts seeking to connect the Nile to the Red Sea. Container ships unloading in Mumbai's harbor's dock, where Alexander's fleet once unloaded Greek olive oil for Indian spices. Even the rhythm of modern logistics owes him a debt, the standardized cargo containers revolutionizing 20th century shipping mirror the uniform amphora sizes his quartermasters imposed to streamline ancient supply chains. Perhaps the most unexpected legacy lies in the digital realm. The fiber optic cables snaking along the old royal road's path, linking Istanbul to Islamabad with pulses of light, follow the same vulnerability-free corridors Macedonian engineers prioritized. Modern telecom companies paid top dollar for geological surveys conducted along Alexander's routes, knowing if a path worked for ox carts in 300 BC, it'll work for underground cables today. The internet's physical backbone, it turns out, shares DNA with history's first information superhighway. Tourists driving Turkey's D300 highway rarely realize they're traversing a living museum. That gentle curve outside Antalya, designed to accommodate the turning radius of a Macedonian supply wagon, the rest stops spaced every 25 miles. Precise modern equivalents of Alexander's way stations, now serving diesel instead of barley. Even the roadside diners unknowingly continue a tradition, their menus blending Greek, Persian, and Anatolian dishes, just as travelers' stops did 23 centuries ago. The ultimate proof of this enduring vision lies in war and peace alike. When NATO needed to supply Afghanistan in the 21st century, their convoys took the same Khyber Pass route Alexander cleared for his elephants. Meanwhile, the UN's Silk Road Initiative spends billions reviving the very trade corridors Macedonian engineers stitched together, now with high-speed rail instead of camel caravans. Alexander's ghost lingers in every shipping container crossing the Caspian, every gas pipeline tracing the Oxus River's ancient bed. His empire fell, but the pathways he forged became the world's circulatory system, pumping goods, ideas, and energy across continents, just as they did when the first Greek mile markers were planted in the dust. At Gaugamela, the fate of empires didn't hinge on swords alone. It turned on dust. That's what Darius Roman III failed to understand as he arrayed his Persian forces across the Mesopotamian plain in 331 BC. His war chariots, armed with scythes designed to slice through infantry, needed hard, flat ground to reach lethal speed. But Alexander's scouts had spent weeks studying every inch of that terrain. They noted how seasonal rains left patches of loose soil near the Euphrates' old flood channels, invisible traps that would bog down chariot wheels. When battle commenced, Macedonian cavalry deliberately lured Persian charioteers into these soft zones, turning Darius' deadliest weapons into helpless targets. This wasn't just combat, it was geographical chess where rivers had written the rules long before armies arrived. Supply lines played an equally brutal role. While Darius could draw from nearby Babylon's granaries, Alexander's forces relied on a slender lifeline stretching back to Tyre, 800 miles of vulnerable road. Persian cavalry raids repeatedly severed this thread, forcing Macedonian troops to survive on reduced rations. The turning point came when Alexander captured a Persian scout carrying detailed maps of his own supply routes. Overnight, he reversed the game. his cavalry began ambushing Persian foragers along the Tigris, strangling Darius' forces not with blades but with empty stomachs. Rivers became the ultimate arbiters, control the crossings, and you controlled who ate. Hydrology shaped strategies in unexpected ways. At the Hydaspes River in 326 BC, Alexander faced King Porus wore elephants' beasts that could trample phalanxes like grass. But monsoon-swollen currents gave him an edge. While Porus assumed the raging river was impassable, Macedonian engineers built floating bridges upstream under cover of darkness. They timed the crossing to exploit a hydrological quirk, pre-dawn hours when melting snowmelt briefly eased the current's fury. This split-second window allowed Alexander to flank Porus' forces, proving that understanding a river's rhythm could outweigh numerical superiority. Siege warfare revealed even cleverer adaptations. During the siege of Tyre, Phoenician engineers had designed the city's walls to withstand naval assaults from any angle. Alexander's response: he turned the sea into a road. His crews dredged sand and rubble to build a half-mile causeway, transforming a maritime stronghold into a land target. But the real innovation came in synchronizing tides. Construction only happened during ebb tides when currents wouldn't sweep away their work. 7 months of this tidal ballet turned an island fortress into a peninsula, rewriting the rules of coastal combat. The ultimate testament to Alexander's logistical brilliance came during his Gedrosian desert march. Facing 700 waterless miles, he ordered herds of goats driven ahead of the army. Why? Their hooves broke up the sun-baked crust, revealing damp subsoil where his engineers could dig emergency wells. When scouts found a dry riverbed, they didn't abandon it. They excavated the old bends where groundwater often lingered. These weren't just survival tactics, they were masterclasses in reading landscapes like living maps. Later generals would study these campaigns with awe. At Cannae, Hannibal copied Alexander's river crossing feints. Caesar's bridge over the Rhine borrowed Macedonian pontoon techniques. Even Napoleon's invasion of Egypt mimicked the supply depots Alexander had placed along the Nile. But perhaps the most striking legacy lies in modern war colleges, where cadets still analyze Gorgamela's terrain charts. Those long-vanished Macedonian scouts proved a timeless truth. The land isn't just a battlefield, it's the silent commander that whispers victory's secrets to those who know how to listen. The moment Alexander's engineers finished laying the first stones of the royal road, a hidden alchemy began, dust turning to gold. Caravans that once crept cautiously through bandit-infested mountain passes now moved with confidence, their loads growing heavier by the season. Babylonian tax records tell the story. In just 7 years after Alexander secured the routes, trade volume between Susa and Sardis tripled. But this wasn't just about safety, it was about standardization. For the first time, merchants from Greece to India dealt with uniform weights and measures. A mina of silver in Ephesus held the same value as in Bactria, with Macedonian stamped coins accepted from the Nile Delta to the Hindu Kush. The roads didn't just connect places, they synchronized economies. Spices became the empire's liquid gold. Cinnamon from Sri Lanka, once so rare it was worth its weight in silver, began appearing in Athenian market stalls at prices even bakers could afford. The secret: Alexander's quartermasters eliminated middlemen by establishing protected warehouses at key junctions. A single papyrus ledger from Memphis details how pepper shipments traveled from Indian ports up the Indus, across the Persian plateau, and down the Euphrates, all under military escort. The savings were staggering. Where previously 20 different tolls might devour 60% of a cargo's value, now a single 5% imperial tariff covered the entire journey. Silk routes tell an even richer tale. When Macedonian soldiers first encountered Chinese silk in Sogdian markets, they called it woven wind for its impossible lightness. Within a generation, Greek weavers in Antioch were unraveling silk threads to blend with local linen, creating hybrid fabrics that fetched astronomical prices in Rome. The real innovation came in financing. Alexander's successors established letters of credit between Alexandria and Samarkand, allowing merchants to deposit funds in one city and withdraw them thousands of miles away, an ancient prototype of banking that supercharged long-distance trade. Cities grew fat on this circulatory system. Babylon's markets expanded to cover 50 new acres, their stalls overflowing with Baltic amber and Arabian frankincense. Tax revenues from just the Euphrates River tolls could fund an entire legion for a year, but the most transformative wealth flowed silently. Ideas. A pottery workshop in Pella might adopt Persian glazing techniques while selling to Celtic tribesmen who paid with British tin. The roads carried not just goods but the recipes for making them, turning local specialties into empire-wide industries. The true measure of this economic revolution lies in the ordinary. A humble shoemaker in Damascus could now source Libyan leather, Cretan dyes, and Anatolian buckles without leaving his district. Farmers along the Tigris planted cash crops for export rather than subsistence, knowing the roads would carry their harvests to reliable buyers. Even slaves, the darkest facet of this trade, moved along these routes with shocking efficiency, their prices standardized from Macedonia to the Punjab. Alexander's most enduring genius was recognizing that conquest meant little without circulation. By the time of his death, the royal road wasn't just moving wealth, it had become wealth. The very dust stirred by caravan feet held value, as innkeepers sold beds to travelers, blacksmiths shod their animals, and scribes drafted their contracts. This wasn't an empire built on plunder, but on the endless, pulsing flow of goods and gold that turned pathways into power. Messages traveled faster than armies in Alexander's empire, and that speed was no accident. His couriers didn't just ride hard, they rode smart, swapping horses at way stations spaced precisely 8 miles apart, the exact distance a galloping steed could sustain peak speed before exhaustion. Persian royal messengers had pioneered relay systems, but Alexander's innovation was specialization. Light Armenian ponies carried urgent military dispatches, their riders trained to memorize messages verbatim as backup against lost or stolen scrolls. For heavier cargo, maps, siege plans, even delicate astronomical instruments, Bactrian camels moved in unbroken chains, their swaying pace calculated to prevent damage to fragile contents. A report from the Indus frontier could reach Babylon in 11 days, a pace that wouldn't be matched until the 19th century Pony Express. Spies thrived in this information ecosystem. Disguised as merchants, Macedonian intelligence agents used the same roads to smuggle out clay tablets detailing enemy fortifications or the mood of local populations. One surviving scrap of parchment from a Susa archive reveals how scouts embedded with caravans counted the number of cooking fires in hostile camps at night, estimating troop numbers by the smoke plumes. But the real espionage masterstroke was Alexander's use of news contamination. By deliberately leaking false plans through certain way stations, say, rumors of an impending attack on Egypt when his real target was Persia, he could gauge the loyalty of regional governors based on how quickly those lies reached enemy ears. The system's vulnerability became its strength during crises. When the Macedonian general Parmenion uncovered a plot against Alexander's life in 330 BC, the message raced 2,000 miles from Ecbatana to Babylon in just 9 days via a chain of bonfire signals by night and polished bronze mirrors reflecting sunlight by day. This wasn't mere communication, it was geopolitical telepathy, shrinking an empire the size of modern Europe into something a single man could practically oversee. Misinformation flowed as freely as truth. After defeating Darius at Gaugamela, Alexander circulated exaggerated accounts of Persian losses through the royal roadway stations, knowing merchants would carry these stories to demoralize distant holdouts. The tactic worked so well that several Persian garrisons surrendered upon hearing third-hand reports of the battle before Macedonian forces even appeared. Conversely, when rebellion simmered in Bactria, his spies flooded local markets with rumors of approaching reinforcements, sometimes enough to quell unrest without drawing a single sword. The courier network's true legacy lies in its bureaucracy. Every message bore a clay seal noting its origin, destination, and priority level. High-status dispatches traveled in hollowed-out staffs carried by pairs of identical twins, a psychological trick to make interceptors doubt which runner actually carried the real message. Waystation logs recorded not just arrivals and departures, but the physical condition of horses and riders, creating an early form of performance metrics. This system became so trusted that when Alexander died, his generals used it to coordinate the empire's division across 3 continents, proving that information, once set loose on those roads, could outpace even mortality. Yet for all its sophistication, the network had one flaw Alexander never anticipated. The same roads that carried his orders also carried grief. When his beloved companion Hephaestion fell ill in Ecbatana, the king's desperate plea for physicians traveled at record speed, but the return message announcing Hephaestion's death moved even faster, carried by riders who knew no amount of haste could undo what had already happened. In that moment, the empire's magnificent information highway became just a long, cruel corridor of loss, proving that some messages, no matter how swiftly delivered, arrived too late. Alexander's roads and rivers didn't just connect cities, they rewrote the very geography beneath them. Imagine vast stretches of ancient forests vanishing overnight, their timber fueling the empire's insatiable need for bridges, ships, and siege engines. In Macedonia alone, records suggest entire cedar stands were leveled to build the fleet that crossed the Hellespont, but the real ecological transformation happened in the east. Along the Indus Valley, engineers cleared floodplain forests to straighten river bends, unintentionally disrupting seasonal fish migrations that local communities had relied on for centuries. The same roads that carried Macedonian spears also carried invasive species rats from Mediterranean ships gnawed through Central Asian grain stores, while foreign weeds choked out native grasses along newly widened highways. Irrigation projects brought both bounty and imbalance. In Babylonia, Alexander's engineers revived ancient canal systems, turning parched fields into wheat oceans that could feed 500,000 soldiers. But diverting the Euphrates tributaries had unintended consequences downstream. Marshes that once teemed with fish and reeds, crucial habitats for everything from migratory birds to water buffalo, began shrinking within a generation. Archaeologists have found clay tablets from Uruk complaining of salinized soil, a side effect of over-irrigation that would eventually turn parts of Mesopotamia into the dust bowls seen today. Urban expansion left its own scars. Each new Alexandria required millions of baked bricks, their kilns devouring local fuel supplies. Near Ai Khanoum in Afghanistan, pollen samples show a dramatic decline in pistachio trees after Macedonian builders discovered their wood burned hotter and longer than alternatives. The very roads meant to sustain the empire sometimes undermined it. Soil erosion from deforested hillsides silted up harbors, while overgrazing by army livestock turned grasslands into deserts. A poignant letter from a garrison commander in Gedrosia begs for replacement horses, noting the local forage had been eaten to the roots by our own herds. Yet nature fought back in unexpected ways. In Egypt, Nile crocodiles claimed Macedonian canals as new territory, delaying construction until priests negotiated offerings to the god Sobek. Flash floods in the Hindu Kush repeatedly wiped out carefully engineered roads, proving even Alexander's will couldn't conquer monsoon seasons, the most ironic twist. Some of his improvements became ecological lifelines. Date palms planted along Persian highways to shade troops grew into sprawling oases that still sustain travelers today, while abandoned Macedonian quarries in Anatolia became reservoirs for rare amphibians. The true legacy of this environmental engineering lies in its contradictions. The same roads that accelerated deforestation also allowed drought-stricken regions to receive emergency grain. Rivers straightened for warships became unexpected allies against floods. Alexander's empire left scars on the land, but also unintentional sanctuaries, proof that even the grandest human designs must eventually bend to nature's older, deeper rhythms. For every stone Alexander's engineers laid, there were hands waiting to pry them loose. The gleaming highways that connected his empire also exposed its vulnerabilities, stretching taut like overstretched bowstrings, ready to snap under pressure. Local tribes from Bactria to Babylon quickly realized that while they couldn't defeat Macedonian phalanxes in open battle, they could strangle their lifelines. Sogdian rebels perfected the art of nighttime sabotage, digging trenches across freshly laid roads or collapsing mountain passes with carefully placed boulders. In Gedrosia, nomads poisoned wells along caravan routes, forcing supply trains into deadly detours. Even the rivers became battlegrounds. Persian loyalists uprooted mile markers along the Euphrates, sending Macedonian patrol boats spiraling into disorienting loops. The most sophisticated resistance came from places where geography and culture intertwined. Hindu Kush villagers, knowing Alexander's armies relied on local guides, deliberately led scouts into box canyons or across unstable scree slopes. Tax collectors sent to prosperous Indus Valley towns often found markets eerily empty, not because of poverty, but because merchants had developed hidden trails bypassing official toll stations. Archaeologists have uncovered clay tablets near modern Herat, detailing an elaborate shadow economy where goods moved along goat paths high above the royal road. Their routes communicated through coded embroidery patterns on nomadic textiles. Religious backlash added fuel to the fire. Zoroastrian priests in Persia denounced the bridges spanning sacred rivers as insults to the divine order, rallying mobs to burn them during holy festivals. Egyptian farmers along the Nile sabotaged irrigation channels built by Macedonian engineers, fearing the foreign ditches disrupted the annual floods sent by Osiris. In one striking act of defiance, Bactrian shamans predicted doom for any who used Alexander's roads during certain lunar phases, a superstition that effectively shut down traffic for days each month without a single drawn sword. The empire struck back with brutal creativity. Macedonian garrisons began stationing troops not just in cities but at critical river bends and mountain passes, creating choke points impossible to avoid. Engineers designed bridges with removable central sections that could be withdrawn like drawbridges, cutting off rebellious regions. Some of the most revealing archaeological finds are lead curse tablets buried beneath way stations, inscribed with threats against road saboteurs in both Greek and local languages, proof that psychological warfare accompanied military might. Yet the greatest limit to Alexander's control wasn't rebellion but adaptation. The same nomadic tribes that raided his supply trains began mimicking Macedonian tactics, using captured engineers to build their own fortified passes. Persian nobles who initially rejected the new roads soon realized they could exploit them. One satrap's archives show him secretly taxing unofficial traffic at twice the royal rate. Even the vaunted royal highway gradually sprouted unauthorized side trails like capillaries branching from an artery, as locals reclaimed agency over their own movement. This tension between central power and regional defiance never truly resolved. Modern satellite imagery reveals a telling pattern, where Alexander's straight, geometrically perfect roads meet older, winding paths. The ground often shows layers of destruction and repair. The empire's infrastructure may have shaped the land, but the land and its people shaped back, leaving behind a record not of total conquest, but of endless negotiation between ruler and rule. Those dusty mountain switchbacks and riverbank detours tell the quieter truth. Even history's most dazzling empires could never fully control the ground beneath their feet. For all their brilliance, Alexander's engineers weren't magicians. They wrestled with a world that refused to bend quietly. Take the Gedrosian Desert disaster. A supply convoy of 2,000 pack animals vanished overnight when a flash flood transformed a dry wadi into a roaring torrent. Scouts had assured the route was safe, but no one accounted for distant mountain rains sending walls of water through bone-dry channels. The aftermath was grim. Soldiers digging through mud-caked wreckage to salvage moldy grain sacks, while camels bloated from drinking briny runoff lay dead beside shattered carts. This wasn't just bad luck, it was a brutal lesson in hydrology's unpredictability. Bridges became particular Achilles' heels. At the Oxus River, a meticulously constructed pontoon bridge collapsed under the weight of war elephants, sending beasts and crewmen spiraling into rapids. The Corps' engineers had underestimated how the animals' synchronized marching would amplify stress on the pontoons. The solution was as ingenious as it was simple. Future bridges incorporated staggered walking paths to break rhythmic vibrations, a principle modern engineers still use in pedestrian suspension bridges. Even more humbling was the Indus River debacle, where monsoon-swollen currents snapped mooring cables like thread. Macedonian crews responded by weaving cables from hemp and horsehair, creating ropes with elasticity to absorb the river's tantrums, an innovation later adopted by Mediterranean shipbuilders. Then there were the roads that refused to stay built. Near the Zagros Mountains, entire sections of the Royal Highway kept sliding into valleys after heavy rains. The culprit, a clay-rich subsoil that turned slick when wet. Alexander's engineers eventually discovered that mixing volcanic ash from local deposits into the roadbed created a primitive concrete, stabilizing the route. But not before countless supply wagons had tumbled down slopes, their spilled cargoes of olive oil amphorae leaving greasy stains still visible in the bedrock today. Water betrayed them in subtler ways too. At Babylon, an elaborate canal system designed to irrigate military farms instead flooded barracks when spring melts overwhelmed its channels. The fix revealed Macedonian adaptability. They recruited Babylonian engineers who'd studied the rivers for generations, incorporating their lunar cycle-based flood predictions into redesigns. Similarly, in Egypt, a perfectly straight Macedonian-built canal silted up within months because it ignored the Nile's natural meandering flow patterns. The takeaway, sometimes efficiency had to yield to ecology. The most haunting failures were those of overconfidence. In the Hindu Kush, scouts assured Alexander that a high mountain pass would be clear by midsummer. But when snowmelt lagged, an entire division found itself trapped at 11,000 feet, their Macedonian wool cloaks useless against freezing rains. Frostbite claimed hundreds before local shepherds guided them to lower ground using routes no military map recorded. This disaster birthed a new protocol. Future mountain campaigns would embed nomadic guides permanently with engineering corps. their ancestral knowledge becoming as vital as any siege engine. Yet these catastrophes forged lasting innovations. Collapsed bridges led to modular designs where damaged sections could be replaced without dismantling entire spans. Flooded camps inspired elevated granaries on stilts. Even the infamous Gedrosian disaster yielded a silver lining. The surviving soldiers discovered desert plants whose roots tapped hidden aquifers, knowledge that later fueled oasis agriculture across Persia. Alexander's empire didn't just triumph through strength, it learned through failure, proving that every river's rebellion and road's betrayal ultimately wrote textbooks for the next generation of builders. History books love to paint Alexander's roads as arteries of war, pulsing with soldiers and supply carts, but they forget the quieter footsteps that kept the empire alive. Among the dust and hoofbeats, women moved as merchants, pilgrims, and power brokers, their stories etched not in marble but in scattered pottery shards and overlooked ledger entries. Take the clay tablets from Babylon's markets, listing female merchants like Ribatu, who shipped linen and spices from Egypt to Persia with her own caravans. Or the grave steels along the royal highway, commemorating women like Thais, the Athenian courtesan who traveled with Alexander's entourage and supposedly sparked the burning of Persepolis, a reminder that influence didn't always wear armor. Diplomacy often rode in palanquins, not on horseback. When Alexander married Roxana of Bactria, her journey from the Oxus River to Babylon wasn't just a romantic saga, it was a political roadshow. Her entourage included Sogdian weavers who taught Greek women advanced dye techniques at waystation workshops, while her Bactrian guards exchanged combat styles with Macedonian soldiers during rest stops. Even hostage transfers had unintended consequences. Persian noblewomen relocated to Macedonian-held cities became cultural translators, introducing Zoroastrian fire rituals to Greek households and reshaping domestic religious practices across the empire. The roads also carried invisible revolutions. A papyrus fragment from Memphis records a Greek soldier's wife, Demetria, petitioning for a divorce while her husband was stationed on the Indus, proof that mobility could upend traditional family structures. At Ai Khanoum, archaeologists found cosmetics containers from the Mediterranean alongside Central Asian fertility amulets in the same household, suggesting intermarriage wasn't just political but deeply personal. And let's not forget the unnamed women who sustained the system. The innkeepers feeding travelers at waystations, the laundresses scrubbing mud from cavalry cloaks at river fords, the midwives delivering babies whose first cries echoed across 3 continents. Resistance had a feminine face too. Sogdian rebel queen Spitamine's wife led guerrilla attacks on Macedonian supply trains using knowledge of mountain trails no scout could map. In Gedrosia, desert priestesses poisoned wells rather than let conquerors drink, their sabotage recorded in Greek logs as bad water gods. Even Roxana, often reduced to a pawn in histories, likely used her position to funnel Bactrian intelligence to Macedonian generals. After all, her letters home traveled the same roads as Alexander's spies. The greatest testament to these women's legacy lies in what they carried. Not just silk or silver, but ideas. Babylonian astronomy texts annotated by Greek hands in the margins. Indian medicinal herbs repurposed for childbirth by Egyptian midwives. Persian nursery rhymes hummed to half-Macedonian children in military camps. These roads didn't just connect places, they blended worlds in ways no battlefield could, with women stitching the seams. Their footsteps may have faded, but the patterns they wove into the empire's fabric endure if you know where to look. Along the royal road's dust, where traders haggled over silk and spices, quieter transactions unfolded, ones that traded not in gold, but in gods. A Zoroastrian priest traveling west might pause at a Babylonian waystation, his sacred fire altar sparking curiosity among Greek soldiers who'd never seen flames worshipped as divine. Further east, Buddhist monks hitching rides on Macedonian supply carts carried palm leaf sutras that would one day transform Central Asia's spiritual landscape. These roads didn't just move armies, they became conveyor belts for the soul, where beliefs mingled as freely as the languages shouted in market squares. Archaeologists have uncovered startling evidence of this spiritual cross-pollination. Near the Oxus River, a gilded statuette of Athena holds a lotus flower, her helmet adorned with Persian sun symbols. In Taxila, a stupa's foundations contain Greek coins placed there as votive offerings by Macedonian converts to Buddhism. Even the Dead Tell Tales, a Bactrian noble's tomb, combines Zoroastrian astral symbols with Greek-style funeral masks, suggesting his family hedged their bets for the afterlife. The most revealing finds are humble clay amulets worn by merchants, some bearing the image of Apollo on one side and the Buddha on the reverse, as if covering all celestial bases. Rivers served as liquid cathedrals. Hindu pilgrims bathing at the Indus confluence points encountered Greek philosophers debating reincarnation on the bank's exchanges that likely inspired the Indo-Greek King Menander's famous Buddhist dialogues. The Nile, long sacred to Isis and Osiris, suddenly hosted processions for Dionysus, whose wild rites resonated strangely well with Egyptian harvest festivals. At Babylon's ziggurats, Chaldean astrologers compared star charts with Macedonian seers, blending Mesopotamian celestial omens with Greek zodiacal lore. Water didn't separate these faiths, it baptized their collisions. Language itself transformed to accommodate new devotions. Ashokan edicts carved across northwest India appear in flawless Greek, not just translations but theological adaptations. The word Dharma, Buddhist law, gets rendered as Eusubeia, Greek for piety, while Zoroastrian, Ashar, cosmic truth, becomes Dike, justice. This wasn't mere semantics, it was doctrinal alchemy. A single bilingual inscription from Kandahar shows Apollo praised with the epithet far-shooting, a direct nod to Mithra's role as solar archer in Persian tradition. The real surprise, how quickly these hybrid beliefs took root. Within a generation of Alexander's death, there were Greeks circumcising their sons in Egyptian temples, while Persian magi studied Pythagorean numerology. Buddhist monasteries in Gandhara commissioned Greek sculptors to carve the first human images of the Buddha, breaking from centuries of aniconic tradition. Even Judaism absorbed elements. The Hanukkah story's miracle of oil echoes Zoroastrian fire rituals encountered during the Seleucid era. This spiritual free trade had its backlash. Conservative Zoroastrians destroyed corrupted fire temples where Greek-style statues stood beside eternal flames. Brahmin priests in India composed texts warning against Yavana, Greek polluters of Vedic rites. But the genie couldn't be rebottled. By the time Rome rose to power, the religious DNA of half the world carried Macedonian markers, proof that roads built for conquest had accidentally become the world's first interfaith highways. The moment Alexander's body cooled in Babylon, his generals turned the roads he built into knives at each other's throats. Seleucus, the cunning survivor, saw the royal highway not just as a trade route but as a spine of steel. He fortified every major river crossing from the Tigris to the Indus, installing loyal garrisons where Darius once posted toll collectors. His secret, he taxed merchants lightly but consistently, using the revenue to maintain way stations as miniature fortresses. A clay tablet from Dora Europos reveals his brilliance. Caravans paid just 1/10 of their cargo's value, but paid it at every checkpoint. The result, a steady income stream that kept roads paved while funding an army capable of crushing rivals. Meanwhile, Ptolemy in Egypt took the opposite approach. He let Nile shipping lanes decay, focusing instead on sea routes to Greece. His genius lay in neglect. By forcing Alexandria's grain fleet to bypass overland routes, he choked competitors' supply lines without drawing a sword. Antigonus One-Eye's fatal mistake was treating infrastructure as loot rather than lifeline. When he seized control of the Persian gates, he taxed traders into bankruptcy to fund immediate wars, leaving bridges to rot. Within 2 years, his messengers took 3 months to cross terrain Alexander's couriers had covered in weeks. The crumbling roads mirrored his crumbling alliances without reliable communication. His satraps rebelled, and his empire fractured like a dried mud brick. Lysimachus in Thrace showed even costlier short-sightedness. He dismantled sections of the royal road to build defensive walls, not realizing he'd severed his own supply arteries. By the time his troops starved during a siege, it was too late to reassemble the shattered network, yet some successors learned from Alexander's playbook. The Seleucids invented a primitive postal system where scrolls were sealed in hollowed-out staffs carried by relay runners, an idea the Romans would later steal. They also kept Alexander's river patrols but added fire beacons atop watchtowers, creating an early warning system that could flash messages from Babylon to the Mediterranean in hours. Ptolemy's descendants, despite their sea focus, revived the Nile's irrigation channels with a twist. They stationed scribes at every lock to record water usage, creating the ancient world's first hydrological database. The starkest contrast emerged in cultural policy. Seleucus encouraged Greek settlers to marry locals along trade routes, creating a bilingual bureaucracy that kept commerce flowing smoothly. His cities like Seleucia on the Tigris became melting pots where Babylonian accountants worked beside Macedonian engineers. The Ptolemies, by contrast, barred Egyptians from senior posts along the Nile transport network, breeding resentment that eventually exploded in rebellion. A papyrus from Edfu tells the story. When a Greek overseer ordered a canal cleared, local farmers sabotaged the project by moonlit, refilling trenches faster than laborers could dig. Infrastructure's true test came during crises. When the Seleucid king Antiochus III faced Roman invasion, his well-maintained roads allowed rapid troop movements that nearly turned the tide at Magnesia. Meanwhile, the last Ptolemaic pharaohs, having neglected the desert wells Alexander dug, watched helplessly as Caesar's army outmaneuvered them using routes they'd forgotten existed. The lesson was clear. Roads and rivers didn't just connect places, they preserved power. Those who treated them as heirlooms thrived. Those who saw them as piggy banks collapsed. In the end, Alexander's greatest gift to his successors wasn't territory, but the pathways to hold it if they were wise enough to walk them. The roads Alexander built didn't vanish when his empire fractured. They seeped into the bones of the world, shaping civilizations that rose long after his name faded from living memory. Those same river fords where Macedonian engineers once anchored pontoon bridges now hum with the vibration of modern suspension cables. The mountain passes they carved through the Hindu Kush still guide container trucks winding between Pakistan and Afghanistan today. There's a haunting continuity to these pathways, as if geography itself remembers the choices made 2,300 years ago. Consider the humble shipping container. Its standardized dimensions trace an unbroken line back to Alexander's uniform axle widths, designed to prevent ruts on the royal road. The GPS-guided freighters plowing through the Suez Canal follow depth soundings first mapped by Macedonian sailors probing the Nile's delta. Even the rhythm of global trade, the pulse of goods moving east to west and back again, beats to a tempo set when Greek merchants first partnered with Bactrian camel drivers. The past isn't just present, it's operational, humming beneath the surface of our daily lives like underground springs feeding a modern metropolis. yet the real magic lies in the intangible. Every time a chef in Istanbul chops cilantro grown from Indian seeds, or a student in Samarkand reads Homer in a classroom built where Greek garrisons once stood, Alexander's network quietly asserts itself. Languages, religions, even the way we measure time all carry fingerprints of that first great stitching together of continents. The roads didn't just move armies, they dissolved barriers, creating a world where a Babylonian astronomer's calculations could end up correcting Athenian star charts, where Persian garden designs could reshape Roman villas. So the next time you order takeout, pause that turmeric in your curry. It likely traveled a route pioneered by Macedonian supply officers, the cotton in your shirt. Its ancestors were first traded for Greek silver along Indus River docks. History's pathways aren't relics, they're living channels, and we're all still flowing through them. If you've enjoyed tracing these ancient connections with me, let's keep exploring. Hit like if you want more deep dives into history's hidden networks. Subscribe to join our next adventure and drop a comment below. Should we unravel the Silk Road's secrets next or follow the Viking sea trails that reshaped Europe? The past is waiting, and every journey begins with a single step, whether it's taken in leather sandals or sneakers.